My dad sacrificed my entire future for my cousin. You won't believe how I took revenge. Hello, read it. From the very beginning, my life was shaped by a profound absence and a lingering sense of loss. My mother died, giving birth to me, an event that not only marked the start of my life but also cast a shadow over my existence. She had longed for a child, yearning to be a mother after years of struggling with infertility. Those who knew her spoke of how overjoyed she was to finally be pregnant, how she had poured all her hopes and dreams into the thought of raising me. But the cruel twist of fate robbed her of that chance, leaving a void that my father could never truly reconcile. Her death became the defining event of my early years, and though I had no memories of her, her absence was a constant presence in our home. My father, overwhelmed by grief and unable to move forward, seemed to hold me at a distance, as though I were a living reminder of what he had lost. His interactions with me were marked by a quiet coldness, an emotional detachment that I could never quite understand as a child, but felt deeply all the same. The house we lived in became a kind of shrine to her memory. Every wall bore photographs of her, capturing moments of joy and vibrance that seemed frozen in time. Her belongings remained untouched, as if she might return at any moment to reclaim them. Her clothes hung neatly in the closet, their faint scent lingering even years after her passing. Her favorite books lined the shelves, their spines well worn from her hands, but now gathering dust. Even the vanity in her room remained as it had been on the last day of her life, with her perfume bottle still half full and her hairbrush resting beside it. As a child, I was drawn to these remnants of her life, seeking a connection to the mother I had never known. I would slip into her room, running my fingers over the soft fabrics of her dresses or flipping through the pages of her books, imagining what it might have been like to sit beside her as she read to me. These moments brought a sense of closeness, though they were tinged with sadness and longing. My father, however, never shared in these reflections. He avoided speaking of her unless prompted by others, and even then, his words were curt and his expression unreadable. He fulfilled his duties as a parent, ensuring that I had food to eat, clothes to wear, and a roof over my head, but there was no affection in his gestures. He was like a shadow moving through the house, present but distant, and I often wondered if he blamed me for her death. The dynamic of our household shifted further when Jake, my cousin, came into our lives. Jake's father, my uncle, had died in a car accident when Jake was 7, leaving him orphaned. My father, who had been close to his brother, took Jake in, offering him the care and support he no longer had. It was a gesture of generosity, but one that came with unintended consequences for me. At first, I welcomed Jake's presence. I hoped that his arrival might bring some warmth and companionship to our quiet, somber home. But it quickly became clear that Jake's place in my father's heart was far greater than my own. Jake was everything I was not: outgoing, confident, and athletic. He excelled in sports, earning trophies and accolades that my father proudly displayed. His charm and charisma made him the center of attention, both at school and at home, and my father seemed to view him as the son he had always wanted. In contrast, I was quiet and studious, more comfortable with books than with people. I worked hard to excel academically, hoping to earn my father's approval, but my efforts were often ignored. When I won first place at the school science fair for a model of the solar system that moved with a hand-crank mechanism, my father barely acknowledged it. Instead, he praised Jake for scoring a goal in a soccer match that same week, a feat he described as far more important. This pattern repeated itself throughout our childhood. My father's attention and admiration were always directed toward Jake, while my accomplishments were dismissed as insignificant. Teachers at school often recognized my potential, commending my essays and projects, but their praise never seemed to reach my father. During one parent-teacher meeting, an English teacher described an essay I had written as one of the best she had ever read, but my father brushed it aside, focusing instead on Jake's latest athletic achievement. As the years went on, I began to internalize the idea that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. My father's favoritism toward Jake was unwavering, and it left me feeling invisible in my own home. I yearned for his approval, clinging to the hope that there was something I could do to change the way he saw me. When it came time to apply for college, I poured all my energy into securing a place at a prestigious university. It was my chance to prove myself, to show my father that I was capable of achieving something great. I worked tirelessly, earning scholarships and grants to cover the costs. I assumed that my father would support me in some way, even if only to recognize the significance of what I had accomplished. But his reaction revealed the depth of his indifference. While I had hoped for even a small gesture of pride or encouragement, I was met with apathy. He seemed uninterested in my plans, as though my future was of no consequence to him. It was a painful realization, one that forced me to confront the truth I had avoided for so long. My father's love and approval were not things I could earn. His favoritism toward Jake was not a temporary phase, but a reflection of the life I had been born into. If I wanted to build a life of my own, free from the shadow of comparison and neglect, I would have to do it without his support. The day I overheard my father on the phone with Jake is one I will never forget. I was passing by his study when his voice caught my attention. There was a rare energy in it, a warmth I had seldom heard. As I paused to listen, I heard him assuring Jake that he would cover his entire college tuition. My heart sank, and I felt my chest tighten as though the air had been sucked out of the room. For a moment, I stood frozen, grappling with the weight of his words. When I later approached him and asked if he might help me as well, his response was swift and cold. He remarked that Jake needed the support more and that he simply couldn't afford to pay for both of us. The sting of his words was like a physical blow. In that single exchange, my hopes of going to college unraveled. The realization that my father would never prioritize me over Jake hit me harder than I could have imagined. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I resolved to find a way, no matter how difficult it might be. I took on a part-time job at a nearby diner, working long shifts in the evenings and on weekends. I scoured every possible resource for scholarships, applying to dozens in the hope that the pieces might come together. But the reality was harsh. The money I managed to gather was never enough. Balancing work, school, and life became an impossible juggling act. The strain was relentless. I would wake up exhausted, attend classes during the day, rush to my shift at the diner, and then stay up late into the night studying. Sleep became a luxury, and I often found myself nodding off in lectures or struggling to concentrate on assignments. Every hour of the day was accounted for, yet there was never enough time, money, or energy to make it all work. After my first semester, the mounting pressure became insurmountable. My grades began to slip, my body was constantly fatigued, and I felt like I was drowning in a sea of responsibilities. When it became clear that I couldn't sustain this pace, I made the heart-wrenching decision to drop out. The part-time jobs I could find barely covered tuition, let alone the costs of textbooks, transportation, and daily living. While I was forced to let go of my dreams, Jake thrived. He was attending a prestigious university, fully funded by my father. His life seemed charmed. Social media was flooded with pictures of his luxurious dorm room, spring break vacations with friends, and the new laptop my father had gifted him for school. Every image felt like salt in an open wound, a reminder of the opportunities he had that I could never grasp. Each update was like a dagger twisting in my chest, deepening my sense of resentment and betrayal. One day, I realized I couldn't endure it anymore. I packed my belongings into a single bag, left home, and cut all ties with both my father and Jake. The decision was agonizing, but I knew it was necessary. I could no longer bear to live in the shadow of a mother I had never known and a cousin who had seemingly taken my place in my father's heart. The home that should have been my sanctuary had become a prison, and leaving it was the only way to reclaim a sense of freedom. The years that followed were the most challenging of my life. With no family to fall back on, I took whatever jobs I could find to make ends meet. I waited tables in noisy diners, worked grueling construction shifts under the blazing sun, and pulled night shifts at gas stations, often working until dawn. The work was exhausting and unrelenting, but it allowed me to keep a roof over my head and food on the table. At times, I felt crushed by the weight of it all, especially when I saw updates from Jake. He graduated with honors and landed a prestigious job right out of college. His posts showcased a life of success and ease, a sharp contrast to my struggles. The resentment I felt during those moments was sharp and bitter, but I pushed it aside and focused on survival. Gradually, I began to rebuild. I found work as a manager at a small bookstore. It wasn't the career I had once dreamed of, but it brought a quiet sense of satisfaction. Being surrounded by books reminded me of the passions I had long suppressed, and the stability of the job gave me the foundation to begin looking toward the future. Determined to reclaim my aspirations, I enrolled in night classes at a community college. It wasn't easy balancing work and studies, but each step felt like progress. Slowly, I was piecing together a life that was mine, free from the weight of the past. Along the way, I found a chosen family, friends who stood by me in ways my biological family never had. They became my support system, celebrating my victories and helping me through my struggles. We spent our free time playing board games, going on camping trips, and sharing stories late into the night. These simple joys brought a sense of belonging I had never known. For a time, I believed I had finally left my past behind. But life is a way of bringing back what you least expect. One afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, the voice on the other end stopped me in my tracks. It was my father, and I hadn't heard from him in over 3 years. His tone was different, marked by weariness and desperation. He began with small talk, asking about my life in a way that felt forced and unnatural. Then, after a pause, he revealed the real reason for his call. He needed money. A lot of it. For a moment, I was speechless. This was the same man who had refused to support me through college, who had poured all his resources into Jake. Now he was turning to me for help. The irony was almost laughable. When I asked why he wasn't seeking Jake's help, he hesitated before admitting that Jake was too busy with his new job to offer assistance. Hearing this, I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. For years, I had been told that Jake was the golden boy, the one who deserved everything. Now, when my father needed help, Jake wasn't there. My father tried to express regret, mumbling something about wanting to make amends for his mistakes. But the words rang hollow. They couldn't erase years of neglect and favoritism. I made it clear to him that things had changed. I was no longer the child desperate for his approval, willing to bend over backward for a scrap of affection. My life was my own now, and I wasn't about to jeopardize it for someone who had never been there for me. That phone call marked a turning point. It reminded me of how far I had come and how much strength I had found within myself. I had built a life on my terms, free from the shadows of my past, and I wasn't about to let anything take that away. After the phone call ended, I was left with a storm of emotions. My father had tried to play the role of a remorseful parent, but I had cut the conversation short, unwilling to entertain his sudden change of heart. There was a twinge of guilt when I turned him away. He was still my father, after all, and a part of me felt that I should have been more understanding. But a much larger part of me felt a profound sense of relief. For the first time, I had stood up for myself. I hadn't caved to the need for his approval that had governed so much of my life. In the days that followed, I replayed the conversation in my head countless times. Questions swirled in my mind, and I found myself second-guessing my decision. Had I done the right thing? I thought about all the times I had needed him, and he wasn't there, not just for major moments like college tuition, but for all the small, formative experiences when a child needs a father. Memories of his absence flooded back. I remembered my first heartbreak at 16. Her name was Sarah, and I had been head over heels convinced she was the one. When she ended things to be with one of the football players, I was devastated. I came home that day, eyes swollen and red from crying. My father was in his usual spot on the couch, watching TV. I stood in the doorway for a moment, hoping he might notice my distress, ask what was wrong, or offer some kind of comfort. Instead, he barely looked up and made a dismissive comment. I went to my room and cried myself to sleep, feeling more alone than ever. There was also the time I got my driver's license. Most of my friends had fathers who taught them how to drive, patiently sitting in the passenger seat during lessons. Not mine. I had to beg our neighbor, Mr. Johnson, to teach me. When I finally passed my test, I came home beaming with pride. My father was in the garage working on his car with Jake. I showed them my new license, and while Jake offered a few congratulatory words, my father merely nodded and went back to explaining something about the engine to Jake. He never once let me drive his car. These memories served as a reminder of how little support he had given me throughout my life. Yet, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble he was in now to reach out to me for help. My father had always been a proud man, sometimes to a fault. For him to ask for money, something significant must have happened. Despite everything, a part of me worried about him. But then I thought about all the times I had worried about my own future, scraping by after dropping out of college, and how he had shown no concern for me then. When I left home, I had to navigate life on my own. I moved to a new town where no one knew me, determined to start fresh. I found a small, cramped studio apartment that I could barely afford and threw myself into whatever work I could find. By day, I cleaned houses, and by night, I worked as a bartender. The hours were grueling, and the exhaustion was constant. On some nights, I would come home after a shift at the bar, my feet aching and my clothes reeking of smoke and spilled beer, and I would lie awake wondering if I had made a mistake. Could I have stayed home, swallowed my pride, and tried to mend things with my father? Maybe. But every time I thought about the judgment and the constant feeling of not being good enough, I knew I had made the right choice. Leaving was the only way I could begin to find myself, free from his shadow and the weight of his indifference. As the days passed after his call, I began to feel more certain about my decision. By refusing to help him, I had finally reclaimed control over my life. I wasn't the same desperate kid he could push aside or ignore. I had built a life for myself, one that didn't rely on him or his approval. I owed him nothing, yet a small part of me was curious about what had brought him to this point. What could have happened that Jake, the perfect child, either couldn't or wouldn't help? I found myself tempted to dig deeper, to unravel the circumstances that had led my father to reach out to me after all this time. Did I really want to open that door again? Was it worth dredging up all the pain and resentment I had worked so hard to leave behind? I considered contacting Jake's mother, my aunt. While she had always been a bit cold, she was generally kind to me, and I thought she might have some insight. The last time I saw her was at a family gathering before I left home for good. I remembered the way she hugged Jake tightly, beaming with pride over his acceptance to a prestigious college. The image stayed with me, a reminder of the favoritism that had defined our family dynamic. For now, I kept my distance, unsure of whether I truly wanted to re-engage with the people and memories I had spent so long trying to escape. The past was a heavy burden, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to carry it again. When it had been my turn to say goodbye at that family gathering years ago, my aunt had offered only a weak smile and a brief pat on the shoulder. That memory stuck with me as I contemplated whether to reach out to her for answers. Ultimately, I decided against it. The lukewarm gesture she had given me before I left made it clear where I stood in her eyes. I resolved not to contact her, unsure whether I even wanted to stir up the emotions tied to those relationships. I found myself torn between two impulses. On one hand, I wanted to leave the past behind and focus on the life I was building for myself. On the other, I couldn't shake the curiosity about what had gone wrong between my father and Jake. The dynamic that had shaped my entire childhood now seemed to be unraveling, and part of me wanted to understand why. Time passed, but the questions lingered. About a month later, my curiosity got the better of me. Hesitation gave way to action, and I decided to investigate why my father had suddenly reached out for help and why Jake, the favored son, was nowhere to be found. I started by reaching out to family friends who were still in touch with my father. At first, people were reluctant to share much, but little by little, I pieced together the details. The first call I made was to Mrs. Peterson, my mother's best friend. She had always been kind to me growing up and seemed surprised but happy to hear from me. After a bit of small talk, I carefully steered the conversation toward my father and Jake. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, her tone shifting as she sighed deeply. Then she began to fill me in. It turned out my father had gone far beyond just paying for Jake's college tuition. Over the years, he had poured every available resource into supporting Jake's ambitions. He had helped Jake with the down payment on a house, bought him a car, and even invested in a business venture Jake wanted to pursue. To fund all of this, my father had taken out loans and maxed out his credit cards, pushing himself deep into debt. Mrs. Peterson recounted a conversation she'd had with my father a few years earlier. He had been proudly bragging about Jake's successes, speaking about how Jake was destined to become a prominent businessman. When she asked about me, my father's response had been dismissive. He had shrugged and said he hoped I was doing okay. Mrs. Peterson admitted she had been shocked by his indifference, but she hadn't known how to address it at the time. Next, I reached out to my old neighbor, Mr. Johnson, the same man who had taught me to drive. He had always been observant, and he didn't hold back as he shared more recent developments. According to him, Jake had convinced my father to invest heavily in a tech startup he was launching with some college friends. My father had even gone so far as to remortgage the house to fund the venture. The startup, however, had failed. Jake's business plans had crumbled, leaving him struggling financially. The high-paying job my father had so proudly boasted about wasn't as stable as it seemed. When my father turned to Jake for help with his mounting debt, Jake had claimed he couldn't spare anything. Mr. Johnson mentioned an argument he had overheard between Jake and my father just a few weeks earlier. Jake had shown up in a flashy new car, despite his claims of financial difficulty. My father had confronted him about the failed business and the money he had invested. The argument grew heated, with Jake deflecting blame and insisting the market had shifted unpredictably. He had promised to pay back the money eventually, but left abruptly, driving off and leaving my father standing alone, visibly defeated. As I processed all this, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. For years, I had lived in the shadow of Jake, constantly compared to him and made to feel like I didn't measure up. Now, the image of Jake as the golden child had been shattered. My father had placed all his hopes and resources into Jake, and those hopes had crumbled. But alongside that satisfaction was a deeper exhaustion. I felt tired of the endless family drama, tired of the lingering pain, and tired of wondering what might have been. I couldn't stop thinking about how different things could have been if my father had chosen to invest in me instead of putting all his faith in Jake. As I sat with these thoughts, I realized that I had no obligation to carry the weight of my father's choices. I had built my life on my own, without his help or approval. And while part of me was curious to learn more, to dig deeper into the dynamics that had led to this moment, I also knew that reopening those wounds might not be worth it. For now, I've decided to let things lie. The past has shaped me, but it doesn't define me. My focus remains on the present and the future I'm working toward. One built on my own terms, free from the shadows of old family expectations. If my father had invested in me the way he did in Jake, my life might have looked completely different. Maybe I would have finished college, pursued a successful career, and found myself in a position of stability and prosperity much earlier. Yet, as I reflected on the path I had taken, I couldn't deny the ways my struggles had shaped me. The hardships I endured taught me lessons I might not have learned otherwise. Lessons about self-reliance, perseverance, and the value of forging my own path. I thought back to the years following my decision to leave home and drop out of college. Those times were defined by constant hustle and unrelenting challenges. I worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, often sacrificing comfort for survival. My meals were usually limited to instant ramen or whatever else I could afford on a shoestring budget. Long shifts left me exhausted, but I refused to give up on the dream of a better future. Even without the structure of formal education, I continued to learn, poring over books, online courses, and any resource I could find in my limited spare time. It was a grueling journey, but it taught me resilience. I learned how to stand on my own 2 feet, how to weather the storms of life, and how to take pride in the victories, no matter how small they brought. As I reflected on these experiences, I thought about my father's apology. After much deliberation, I decided to send him a message. In it, I acknowledged that I was aware of what was happening with Jake and the financial troubles he now faced. I chose my words carefully, avoiding any tone of gloating or triumph. Instead, I simply expressed the hope that he could now see how his choices had affected not just Jake, but me as well. His response came a few hours later, and it was longer than I expected. He apologized for the way he had treated me, admitting that he had been unfair and acknowledging the favoritism that had defined so much of our relationship. He spoke about how his grief over my mother's death had consumed him and clouded his judgment, making it difficult for him to be present for me when I needed him most. He also wrote about my mother, telling me that she would have been proud of the person I had become. For a moment, his words softened the defenses I had built around myself. But then he asked for more. He wanted to meet and talk, to try and mend the fractured bond between us. I sat with his message for hours, torn between conflicting emotions. A part of me, the part that had spent years yearning for his approval, wanted to say yes. I imagined an idealized version of reconciliation where we talked through everything and he finally saw me for who I was. But the adult I had become, the person forged by years of independence and hard work, was cautious. I knew better than to hope for a magical resolution. As I considered his request, memories of his absence resurfaced. I thought about my high school graduation, a moment that should have been filled with pride and celebration. Instead, it was marked by the sharp sting of disappointment as I scanned the crowd, searching for a face that wasn't there. I thought about the tiny apartment I had rented after leaving home, furnished with secondhand items and an unshakable determination to make it my own. And most recently, I remembered the promotion I had worked so hard to earn at the bookstore. It was a milestone I celebrated quietly with friends because I had no family to share it with. These memories reminded me of how deeply his absence had shaped my life. They also made it clear that any reconciliation wouldn't be simple or immediate. In the end, I responded with honesty. I acknowledged his apology and appreciated his willingness to reach out, but I explained that words alone could not erase the years of neglect and the pain of his favoritism. I told him I needed time and space to process everything and asked him to respect those boundaries. I also made it clear that I would not be offering financial assistance. His decisions had brought him to this point, just as my own choices had brought me to where I was. While I understood the weight of his circumstances, I knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix the mistakes he had made. As I sent the message, I felt a wave of emotions wash over me. Relief, sadness, and a sense of closure mingled together, leaving me strangely at peace. For so long, I had carried the burden of trying to earn my father's love, constantly questioning why I wasn't enough for him. Now I understood that his actions had never been about me. They were a reflection of his own grief, his inability to cope with loss, and the misplaced priorities that stemmed from those struggles. I am still uncertain about what the future holds for my relationship with my father. Perhaps one day we will have an honest and meaningful conversation about everything that has happened. Perhaps that day will never come. For now, I am focused on my own growth and the life I am building for myself. I continue to work toward my degree, attending night classes, and finding pride in the progress I've made. My life is filled with meaningful relationships, friends who value me for who I am and provide the support I once longed for from my family. Just last week, I helped my friend Sarah, not the Sarah from high school, move into her new apartment. As we unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, it struck me how far I had come. These connections, this chosen family, are what truly matter. They are a reminder that I am not defined by my father's choices or his inability to see my worth. Life is still challenging, but I face it with a sense of purpose and determination that is uniquely my own. For the first time in years, I feel like I am exactly where I am meant to be. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I am confident that I will meet it with the strength I've cultivated through years of perseverance. That strength is mine alone, and it is something no one, not even my father, can take away.